So how do you get this podcast and or this streaming thing going? How do you do it? Well, we'll start with the basics, and that is, some way, you've got to hook up your audio recorder or your streaming equipment to your sound system if that's how you got to operate. In the minimum, you're going to have to hook up a microphone anyway, depending on what you're doing. If it's a house of worship situation, you may be hooking up your entire soundboard to it, but you've got to make that connection into your recording or your streaming equipment. So you connect to the main mixer is the obvious choice to start out with, and indeed that is simple, but it often sounds dry or flat. In other words, you don't have a sense of being there. A long time ago, radio and then television discovered that, for instance, in covering a sporting event, it was very helpful for the enjoyment of the listening or viewing audience to hear the sound of the crowd that was physically present at the event. Well, the same is true in covering your house of worship experience. You need to be able to hear the reaction of the congregation to what is being said. If you hook straight up to the mixer often and then view or listen to what's going on, a lot of times you'll hear somebody say something like, "The pastor told a joke, but I didn't hear anyone laugh." And that's because there weren't any microphones present to pick up the sound of the congregation, what's going on out in the congregation. So we find that's very helpful in enhancing the listening or viewing experience in a podcast or a streaming situation. Indeed, mixing for broadcast, streaming, or podcasting is different from live mixing, the sound mixer who's actually in the auditorium where the service or the program is being held. For instance, in covering music, let's talk about loud instruments such as drums or organ. In the auditorium, often these instruments are so loud by themselves that they don't require any additional amplification through the sound system. But if you want to record or if you want to broadcast, podcast, stream, whatever, it's desirable to pick up some of the sound from these instruments which otherwise would not be picked up, even though they may be plenty loud on their own in the auditorium. Balance among the sources, therefore, is often different. Sometimes it's not sufficient to simply pick up the sound off the live mixing board in the auditorium because certain elements may be too loud or too soft. Very typically, the music was so loud I couldn't hear the soloist. That's a common situation like this because the balance between the singer and the music was different in the live auditorium experience than it needed to be in the recording or the podcast or the stream. Okay? Natural versus artificial effects is another consideration. Often there's enough natural sound in the auditorium, natural reverb or decay, to make a singing performance sound fine without any enhancement by effects at all. But again, in a recording, a broadcast, a podcast, a telecast, whatever you're doing, often the vocal performance sounds dry or flat without some artificial effect, some reverberation or something like that added in. So there's another difference between the live performance mix and the mix that you need to have for your podcast or your recording. Ambient sound, another thing we touched on it a moment ago, listening to the reaction of the congregation in a house of worship experience. Hearing agreement, amens if you're a Southern Baptist, for instance, as I am, or laughter, applause, that kind of thing, the kind of thing you want picked up in a recording or a broadcast. There are certain things we can do, therefore, to enhance what we hear on a podcast or a stream. And one of the first ones is, enhancement one, we say add ambience microphones. So the people who are listening or watching the podcast, the stream, whatever, can hear what the congregation in attendance is doing, to hear feedback from them. And actually what it does is it makes them, the ones who are listening to the recording or the podcast, feel like they are part of the group that is in the auditorium.